Is faith just blind belief, a relic of the past, a crutch for the weak? Or could Christianity actually be the most rational, coherent explanation for life as we know it? In an age where science reigns and skepticism thrives, many people assume that belief in God, especially the Christian God, is outdated, irrational, or even dangerous. Faith, they argue, belongs to an era before we had science, psychology, or modern ethics. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if faith isn't about checking your brain at the door? What if Christianity doesn't just feel true, but actually makes sense? This is exactly what C.S. Lewis set out to explore in Mere Christianity, a series of radio broadcasts during World War II that would go on to become one of the most influential Christian books of the 20th century. Lewis wasn't raised a believer. He was a thoughtful, intelligent atheist who asked big questions. But the more he dug into those questions, the more he found that the Christian story answered them better than anything else. Mere Christianity doesn't begin with doctrine. It begins with something much more personal, our human experience. Lewis starts with the sense we all have, that there's a right and wrong that exists outside of us, that when people cheat or lie, we don't just dislike it. We believe they've violated something objective. That longing for justice, that desire for meaning, it points beyond evolution or biology. It hints at something greater. In this video, we'll unpack Lewis's major arguments and follow the trail he laid, from moral intuition to the existence of God, from the question of instinct to the limits of science, and ultimately to the astonishing claims of Jesus himself. We'll explore why Christianity, far from being irrational, offers one of the most comprehensive, elegant, and intellectually satisfying explanations for reality. Whether you're skeptical or searching, committed or curious, this isn't about pressure. It's about clarity. Because if faith is worth anything, it should be able to face hard questions and offer real answers. So, can Christianity really stand up to scrutiny? Let's find out. C.S. Lewis starts Mere Christianity with an observation so simple yet so powerful that it's easy to overlook. All people, everywhere, seem to believe in a standard of right and wrong, not just a preference or a cultural habit, but a real standard, a moral law. Think about it. If someone cuts in line, cheats in a game, or lies to you, you don't just feel annoyed. You feel wronged. You feel like something unfair has happened, not just to you, but in some objective way. And even more interestingly, the person who wronged you will usually try to justify themselves. I had no choice, they might say, or that wasn't really cheating. Why bother defending yourself unless you believe there's a standard you're supposed to follow? Lewis called this the law of human nature, and he claimed it's something all humans know deep down. It's not something we invent like traffic laws, it's something we discover, like gravity. Across cultures and times, people may disagree on the details, but everyone agrees that things like fairness, courage, honesty, and kindness are virtues, and things like betrayal and cruelty are wrong. Now, here's where Lewis takes it further. If there is a real moral law, where does it come from? Why does it seem to transcend individual opinion or social conditioning? He argues that the moral law is not merely a human instinct. If morality were just instinct, then it would be indistinguishable from any other biological urge, like hunger or fear. But morality often tells us to go against our instincts. When you want to run from danger, but choose to help someone instead, that's not instinct. It's something higher, something commanding. So, if there is this universal sense of ought, this compass that points us to what's right, it must come from somewhere, or someone. Just as a code implies a coder and a law implies a lawgiver, Lewis suggests the moral law points to a moral source beyond ourselves. This doesn't yet prove the God of Christianity, but it does suggest that reality isn't just made of molecules. There's something more, something personal, moral, and intelligent behind the scenes. Lewis understood that some people might say morality is just a product of evolution or social pressure, but he challenged that idea by pointing out that we often resist what society tells us. We celebrate people who go against unjust cultures, not conform to them. And we don't admire someone simply for following instincts. We admire them for choosing what's right, especially when it's hard. He gave the example of Nazi Germany. If morality were just cultural, then we'd have no grounds to say the Holocaust was wrong. We'd simply say it was different, but we don't say that. We say it was evil. That requires a standard outside of any one culture, a universal law that condemns cruelty and honors justice, even when society does not. The moral law, then, is not just a human invention. It's a clue, a whisper from beyond the material world, a signal that behind the universe is not just force, but a moral mind, a mind that cares about right and wrong and expects us to care too. This is the first step in Lewis's journey, to realize that there is more to reality than what we can see, that our shared sense of justice might be one of the clearest fingerprints of God. After introducing the moral law, C.S. Lewis tackles a common objection. Maybe what we call morality is just an instinct, like hunger, fear, or love. Maybe it's just a helpful survival mechanism that evolution wired into us to make sure we cooperate and stay alive. At first glance, that sounds reasonable. We do feel moral urges in our gut, like the impulse to help someone in danger or the guilt that comes from lying. But Lewis says morality can't be just instinct, and here's why. Imagine you hear someone crying for help. One part of you wants to run and help. That's your herd instinct, the drive to protect others in your group. Another part of you wants to stay safe and avoid risk. That's your self-preservation instinct. But then, a third voice enters the scene. A voice that says, "You ought to help. It's the right thing to do." That voice isn't just another instinct competing for attention. It's the judge of instincts. That, says Lewis, is the moral law. Morality, in this view, functions more like a conductor than an instrument. It doesn't play the notes. It tells us which notes to play, and when. If instincts are the keys on a piano, morality is the sheet music. It guides, it coordinates, it elevates. Without it, the result is chaos. But with it, we find harmony, structure, and purpose. Lewis also highlights how we admire people, not for blindly following the strongest instinct, but for choosing to override it in favor of something better. A soldier running into battle to save a friend doesn't follow the survival instinct. He transcends it. We don't celebrate self-preservation. We honor self-sacrifice. That only makes sense if there's something greater than instinct, something that tells us what is truly noble. Another crucial point Lewis makes is about guilt. You don't feel guilty for being tired, hungry, or cold. Those are instincts. But when you betray a friend or lie or ignore someone in need, you feel guilt. And guilt only makes sense if you believe you had a choice between what was easy and what was right. That kind of moral awareness isn't automatic. It's not hardwired like breathing or blinking. It's a signal of something higher, something that doesn't just drive us, but calls to us. A standard that we didn't invent and often fail to live up to. Some might say our sense of right and wrong is just a product of evolution or social conditioning. But Lewis points out that we don't simply follow what society tells us. In fact, the people we admire most, figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, or even Jesus, are people who stood up against the norms of their time. If morality were just a reflection of culture, we'd never have moral reformers, only conformists. So where does this sense of ought come from? Not from instinct, not from culture, but from something beyond us, yet speaking to us. A higher law, a whisper that guides, convicts, and calls us to be more than we are. Lewis believed that this wasn't just an argument for morality. It was a clue, a signpost pointing toward the divine, because a law written on our hearts implies a lawgiver who knows our hearts, and perhaps even loves them. At this point in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis shifts from talking about morality to something even deeper: our view of reality itself. Specifically, he challenges a worldview known as materialism, the belief that nothing exists except matter, energy, and the laws of physics. According to materialism, everything, including human thought, emotion, and morality, is just the result of chemical reactions in our brains. But Lewis saw a huge problem with that idea. If everything is just atoms bouncing around, then our thoughts are just the accidental byproduct of blind physical processes. And if that's true, why should we trust them? Think about it. We trust our reason, our ability to think logically, to distinguish truth from error, to weigh evidence. But if our thoughts are nothing more than the firing of neurons caused by impersonal forces with no concern for truth, then reason itself is undermined. It becomes an illusion. And that means every belief, including belief in materialism, collapses on itself. Lewis wrote, "If the solar system was brought about by an accidental collision, then the appearance of organic life on this planet was also an accident, and the whole evolution of man was an accident too. If so, then all our thought processes are mere accidents, the accidental byproduct of the movement of atoms. And this holds for the materialist's own thoughts, as well as anyone else's. In short, if materialism is true, we lose any basis for trusting our own reasoning. And that includes the reasoning that led us to believe in materialism in the first place. But it's not just logic. Materialism also struggles to explain things we experience every day. Things like love, beauty, purpose, and longing. A purely physical universe has no room for meaning, and yet we crave meaning. We create art, we write poetry, we fall in love, we grieve deeply. These are not chemical accidents. They are signs of something more." Lewis wasn't rejecting science. He respected science deeply. But he believed science was only equipped to study the physical world, not to explain the moral or spiritual dimensions of human life. Just as a microscope can't measure justice, and a telescope can't detect forgiveness, the tools of science are limited by design. What Lewis opposed wasn't science, but scientism, the belief that science is the only way to know anything. He believed that view is both self-defeating and spiritually hollow. He compared it to someone who dissects a musical instrument and concludes that because they can't find music inside the violin, music must not be real. But of course, the music is real. It just exists in a different category, one that requires listening, not slicing. To illustrate further, Imagine explaining a novel solely by analyzing the ink on the page. You'd learn about chemicals and paper, but miss the story. Materialism tries to explain the novel of life without recognizing the author. So what's the alternative? Lewis argued that the Christian worldview makes better sense of what we observe in ourselves and the world. It affirms the power of reason, because our minds were created by a rational God. It accounts for morality, because we were made in the image of a moral creator. And it explains beauty, longing, and love as echoes of the divine, not just neurological quirks. In the end, Lewis believed that materialism reduces the human story to atoms and time. Christianity, on the other hand, tells us we're more than matter. We're meaning bearers, truth seekers, image bearers of a creator who made both our brains and our souls. C.S. Lewis believed that the deepest clues to the meaning of the universe weren't hidden in academic philosophy, but in the quiet longings of the human heart. He argued that within every person there is a desire for something more, something that nothing in this world seems to fully satisfy. We long for love that never fails, for justice that's truly fair, for beauty that takes our breath away and never fades. We search for truth that is unshakable and purpose that goes beyond survival. And yet everything we grasp eventually slips through our fingers. Relationships break, beauty fades, success feels hollow. Even in our best moments, there's a strange ache, a haunting feeling that we're homesick, but we don't know where home is. Lewis called this experience joy, but not happiness in the casual sense. He described it as a deep, inconsolable longing for we don't know what. It's the kind of ache you feel when looking at a sunset or hearing a piece of music so beautiful it hurts. A fleeting glimpse of something beyond. And here's where Lewis makes his brilliant move. He says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. There is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. There is such a thing as water. Humans feel sexual desire. There is such a thing as sex. So if we find in ourselves a desire that no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. This longing, Lewis suggests, is not an illusion or a malfunction. It's a signal, a clue, a God-given hunger for the infinite. And rather than dismiss it, we should follow where it leads. Of course, we try to silence it. We chase after money, pleasure, approval, and distraction. We tell ourselves that if we just get that job or that person or that recognition, we'll finally be fulfilled. But every time we reach the top, we find the same emptiness. Because we were never meant to be satisfied with temporary things.
Think of how we approach vacations, entertainment, or even relationships.
We often expect them to complete us. But what if they were never meant to? What if they are not the destination, but the signposts? What if every fleeting joy, every imperfect beauty, is a breadcrumb that leads us to the source? Lewis didn't see this as a reason to despair. Quite the opposite. He believed this longing pointed to something real, just not in this life. Our homesickness is evidence that we actually have a home we were made for, a home in God. This idea reframes our entire search for meaning. It tells us that our deepest desires are not embarrassing flaws or random brain activity. They are road signs, echoes, shadows of a greater reality. They are the fingerprints of God, gently drawing us back to Him. And this longing connects with everything else we've discussed. Our sense of morality, our capacity for love, our hunger for beauty, all of it points towards something beyond evolution, instinct, or matter. It points to a creator who designed us not just to function, but to yearn for Him. In the end, Lewis believed that the very fact we feel dissatisfied with the world is not evidence that something's wrong with us, but that something greater is waiting for us. Just as thirst points to water, our spiritual longing points to the source of all joy. And that source, he believed, is not a force or a principle, but a person, a God who planted desire in our hearts, not to frustrate us, but to awaken us.
One of the most striking arguments C.S. Lewis makes in Mere Christianity is about the identity of Jesus. Today, many people are comfortable calling Jesus a wise moral teacher, a revolutionary figure, a prophet, a voice for love and peace. But Lewis believed that this view completely ignores what Jesus actually said about himself. Jesus didn't just preach kindness or talk about justice. He claimed to forgive sins. Not just those committed against him, but sins committed against others. He said things like, "I and the Father are one," and before Abraham was, "I am," using the divine name of God from the Old Testament. He accepted worship, forgave sinners, and spoke as if he had existed for all eternity. These aren't things that great moral teachers say. A good man might tell you how to find God, but Jesus claimed to be God. And that leads to Lewis's famous trilemma. He wrote, "A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell." In other words, we can't say Jesus was just a good man. We only have three logical options. Either he was lying, he was deluded, or he was telling the truth. Let's break that down. If Jesus was lying, then he wasn't a good man. He deceived people on the most important matter imaginable, their relationship with God. That makes him not just mistaken, but deeply evil. Yet when we read his words, we don't sense manipulation. We sense integrity, compassion, and unmatched moral clarity. His enemies tried to trap him with questions, but he always answered with wisdom that stunned crowd. If Jesus was deluded, then he thought he was God but wasn't. That would make him mentally unwell, completely disconnected from reality. But again, the brilliance of his teaching, the depth of his wisdom, and his calm courage in the face of death don't match the profile of a madman. Madmen don't deliver the Sermon on the Mount. They don't inspire self-sacrificial love across centuries and cultures. That leaves the third option, that he was telling the truth, that he really was who he claimed to be, the Son of God, the Savior of the world. Lewis didn't reach this conclusion lightly. He had spent years as an atheist, wrestling with these questions, but he found that the life, words, death, and resurrection of Jesus formed a coherent, powerful picture. Not of a myth, not of a liar, not of a lunatic, but of the Lord. Some argue that the trilemma leaves out a fourth option, that Jesus was misunderstood, or that the stories about him were exaggerated later. But Lewis was a scholar of ancient literature. He knew myth from history, and he insisted the Gospels didn't read like legend. They had the texture of eyewitness accounts, full of specific detail, personality, and paradox. He also noted that the earliest followers of Jesus worshipped him as divine, something unthinkable in a fiercely monotheistic Jewish culture unless something extraordinary had happened. The resurrection, the boldness of the apostles, and the explosion of the early church all point to the same conclusion. Something world-shaking occurred. In the end, Lewis challenges us not to patronize Jesus. To say he's a great moral teacher but ignore his central claims is to dodge the real question. Because if Jesus really is Lord, then he's not just a teacher to admire, he's a king to follow. So who do you say he is? That question isn't just historical, it's deeply personal, and how we answer it shapes everything else. After all his exploration of morality, reason, longing in Jesus, C.S. Lewis came to a powerful conclusion. Christianity doesn't just offer a few religious ideas. It offers the most compelling and coherent explanation of reality. For Lewis, it wasn't just that Christianity answered some of life's questions. It answered all of them, and did so more deeply, more beautifully, and more truthfully
than any other worldview. He famously wrote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." In other words, Christianity doesn't just explain spiritual matters. It illuminates all of life. It helps us make sense of the world, ourselves, and even the things that confuse or hurt us most. Let's start with human nature. Christianity explains why people can be so noble and yet so selfish. We were made in the image of God, which accounts for our capacity for love, creativity, justice, and beauty. But we are also fallen, corrupted by sin. That's why even our best intentions can turn destructive. This diagnosis matches what we observe every day in ourselves and others. Then there's morality. Christianity explains why we feel there is a right and a wrong, and why violating that sense produces guilt and shame. We were created with a moral law written on our hearts, given by a moral God. No other worldview explains our moral instincts so fully. Materialism reduces ethics to survival instincts. Relativism denies objective right and wrong. But Christianity affirms both moral law and moral responsibility. What about longing? Christianity doesn't dismiss our deep desires for beauty, love, meaning, and eternity. It explains them. We were made for relationship with God, and our hearts are restless until they find their home in Him. The hunger for more is not a failure of the system. It's a clue about what we were made for. Then there's suffering. Christianity doesn't offer cheap answers to pain, but it does offer hope. It teaches that God entered into our suffering through Jesus. He took on our pain, bore our sins, and defeated death. And because of that, our suffering is not meaningless. Even our worst moments can be redeemed. No other belief system dares to say that God Himself suffers for us. Finally, death and resurrection. Christianity tells a story that ends not with darkness, but with light. Jesus rose from the grave, and through Him, we too can have eternal life. That doesn't just change our future, it changes how we live now. It means there's hope, purpose, and a destiny greater than anything this world can offer. Lewis didn't become a Christian because he was looking for a comforting religion. In fact, he once said, "I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew a bottle of port would do that." He became a Christian because he believed it was true, and because it made sense of everything. And what drew him most was the coherence, the way Christianity connected dots that other systems left scattered. Reason and imagination, justice and mercy, logic and wonder. It didn't flatten mystery, it fulfilled it. It didn't avoid suffering, it transformed it. It didn't promise escape, it offered redemption. It made sense of his reason, his conscience, his joy, and his pain. It explained the world outside and the world inside. It made sense not just in theory, but in life. And for Lewis, that wasn't just intellectually satisfying. It was personally transforming. Christianity didn't just give him a worldview, it gave him hope. It gave him a savior. It gave him life. We've walked through some of the most profound ideas C.S. Lewis ever shared. Ideas about morality, reason, longing, and the person of Jesus. But Lewis never meant these to remain abstract arguments. For him, Christianity wasn't just something to be understood. It was something to be trusted, to be lived. He saw that the world is filled with beauty, but also brokenness. That people are capable of both astonishing kindness and heartbreaking cruelty. That every human heart carries a sense of right and wrong, a hunger for joy, and a longing that nothing in this life seems to satisfy. Lewis came to believe that Christianity alone makes sense of this tension. It says we are created in the image of a good God, but marred by sin. It tells us that our moral compass is no accident, but the voice of our Creator calling us home. It reveals that our desire for more isn't foolish, it's foundational. It's a whisper of eternity. And it tells us that God didn't stay distant, He came close. In the person of Jesus, God entered history, took on flesh, suffered with us, and died for us. And then, He rose again, not as myth, but as history, as reality that changes everything. Lewis didn't follow Jesus because it was convenient or popular. He followed because he was convinced it was true. And in finding truth, he also found joy, meaning, and peace. The question is, what about you? What do you make of the moral law you feel deep inside, the longing you carry that nothing here quite satisfies? The figure of Jesus, who still stands at the center of history and challenges every easy answer. These questions matter, not just for our minds, but for our lives, for our hearts, for our eternity. Lewis's journey from atheism to belief was not a retreat into fantasy, but a surrender to reality. And his story invites us to ask, could it be that the Christian story isn't just a story, but the story, the one we were made for all along? If this video sparked something in you, questions, thoughts, or hope, don't stop here. Explore more, ask hard questions, and most importantly, keep seeking the truth with courage and openness. And if you found this valuable, consider liking their video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. Because truth matters, and it just might change everything.